decision. And the new WBC Super Lightweight Female Champion of the World.
Motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay. This weekend, I'm sure you're all aware, we had a couple of fights. We had a couple of fights involving a couple of pound-for-pound fighters, both on the women's and men's Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. There has been some movement. It's time for some updates. First, we'll start off with the movement on the women's Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. I'm sure you're all aware that this weekend, Katie Taylor unified her IBF and WBA titles with that of Rose Volante, former champion Rose Volante's WBO title, and in doing so, she has directly affected where she falls in line with the other pound-for-pound fighters ranked on this list. And it's time to discuss just how exactly that's going to be reflected in the rankings. For starters, based on the last update to the women's Ring IQ pound-for-pound list, you might have seen that Jessica Tutibap was ranked ahead of both Claressa Shields and Katie Taylor.
At number 3.
But due to recent activity, or the lack thereof, Jessica Tutibap is going to lose ground on the current women's Ring IQ pound-for-pound list, and here's why. Jessica Bop, she only fought 2 times last year. Hindsight being 2020, she only defended her WBA title 2 times last year, whereas comparatively, Claressa Shields, she fought 4 times last year. Picked up a world title or 2 in the process. So we see that in 2018, Claressa Shields was the more active fighter, along with Katie Taylor, who was also the more active fighter comparatively with Jessica Bop. And then we move on to 2019. Now, in 2019, we see that Katie Taylor was a busier fighter than Jessica Bop, and we also see that Claressa Shields is going to be a more active fighter than Jessica Bop, because in 2019, Jessica hasn't had a fight yet, whereas Claressa, she's got the fight with Christina Hammer coming up for the undisputed middleweight championship. So comparatively, both Claressa and Katie have been more active than Jessica Bop, even though she's been around longer than them. It's for that reason that she is beginning to lose ground. It's for that reason that she is going to fall behind Claressa and Katie to the number 5 spot. And the recent activity of Katie Taylor, unifying those 3 titles, it also affects Christina Hammer. Christina Hammer, who in the previous list was ranked ahead of Katie, but now has fallen 2 spots behind. It being that, 1, she wasn't as active as Katie was in 2018, and in 2019, Christina did manage to get in a title defense, a tune-up fight. She did manage to get in a tune-up fight, but comparatively, the quality of competition between the fighters, between Christina and Katie. You got Katie, who's fighting an undefeated champion like herself, unifying all those belts, 3 belts, and then you look at Christina, who was in a tune-up fight. So comparatively, Katie Taylor's keeping busy with a better caliber, better quality of competition, and she was the more active fighter of the 2 in the previous year. So, Christina Hammer falls 2 spots behind Katie Taylor. We then look over at Mariana Barbie Juarez, who was ranked in the number 7 spot of the previous list and has held on to that spot in the current list. It being that Mariana Barbie Juarez fought 4 times last year. Decent quality of competition, not the best per se, but certainly not the worst. She had a very respectable, very busy 2018, and currently she's had a fight against an undefeated contender going into 2019. So it's conceivable that in the next update on the list, she is going to gain ground. 1, because she's busier than a lot of these other girls. 2, she's more accomplished than many of these other girls. And 3, the Claressa Shields versus Christina Hammer fight, whoever loses that fight, they're going to get bumped off the list. So there's going to be movement one way or another. And Barbie Juarez stands to benefit from that movement, because currently, Christina Hammer's ranked just ahead of her. Christina Hammer, who is losing ground, and if she loses to Claressa Shields, will be off the list altogether, allowing Barbie Juarez to move into that spot. And not only that, but hindsight being 2020, Barbie Juarez had a far more active 2018 than Jessica Tutibap, where Jessica Tutibap fought 2 times, Barbie fought 4. And she's already having a more active 2019 than Jessica Bop. Barbie managed to get a title defense in against an undefeated contender, whereas, in 2019, Jessica Bop hasn't defended that WBA title yet. So it's conceivable that by the next update, if Jessica Bop doesn't either unify a title or get in a title defense, it's going to be very hard for her to hold on to that spot. And it's conceivable that Barbie could leapfrog ahead of her if it happens that way. Because she's already busier. She's already the busier fighter. Hindsight is 2020. You know, we can look back and we can see who's been racking up more title defenses, and it just so happens that title defenses are a part of what measures the fighters on this list. Now, in the lower tier of the women's Ring IQ pound-for-pound list, we see that there has also been some movement on the part of the WBC lightweight champion, Delphine Persoon. You know, in the last list, she was ranked behind WBC 140-pound champion Jessica McCaskill, it being that while Jessica didn't have a very active 2018, she did square off against Erika Farias, and she went up in weight to do so. Erika Farias, who was number 1 at 140 pounds and was also the WBC champion and ranked on this list. So in defeating Erika, Jessica emerged on the list. You know, in defeating a pound-for-pound fighter, she became one herself. That's a part of the rules that govern this list. That's why in the previous list, she was ranked ahead of Delphine. But
this year,
once again, hindsight being 2020, you know, in 2019, Delphine has managed to get a title defense in against Melissa St. Ville, whereas Jessica has yet to defend that WBC title. And in racking up that title defense, Delphine Persoon was able to inch ahead of Jessica. You know, in 2018, Delphine racked up a few title defenses, right? And those title defenses, they weren't against high-quality opponents. So that opened the door for Jessica to emerge ahead of her, it being that the one girl Jessica fought in 2018 was better than the 2 or 3 girls that Delphine defended her title against. But now the roles are reversing, and Delphine, who's already the more seasoned fighter, already the more accomplished champion of the two,
by a wide margin,
that opened the door for Delphine, in defeating Melissa St. Ville this year, to move ahead of Jessica. So, you know, unless Jessica gets busy this year, it's conceivable that she may end up at the end of the list, because just as well, Jelena Marjanovic, who's a unified champion, she's got a fight coming up. She's got a title defense of her 2 world titles coming up. I know you might be wondering, how is it that Jelena Marjanovic, who's one of the most accomplished, one of the most seasoned, veteran fighters who currently holds 2 world titles in the featherweight division, how's it possible for her to have ended up at the very bottom of the list? And the reason for that is, well, in 2017, she only fought once. 2018, she only fought once, and she hasn't had a fight this year. But
she's got one coming.
She's got a fight coming up. And it's conceivable that if that title defense proves to be successful, well, she's going to move ahead of Jessica, because Jessica hasn't defended that title yet. She hasn't fought this year at all. So, you know, if it works out that way, Jessica's going to end up in the bottom of the list and, in the process, be in the most danger of being bumped off by a more active fighter with a more credible argument. So, you know, that's the way the cookie crumbles. Those are the recent updates for the women's Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. And now, on to the men's Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. We know what fight took place this weekend. The fight between Mikey Garcia and Errol Spence Jr. Mikey Garcia, who ranked pretty high on the list due to the accumulation of his accomplishments as a professional. Mikey Garcia ranked at number 2, only behind Terrence Crawford. And as a result of that, given the rules that govern the list, that no fighter coming right off a loss can maintain a spot on that list, a rule that not too many people are crazy about. And, you know, just to put it as concisely as possible, to explain the rhyme and the reason for that rule, the reason that no fighter coming off a loss is allowed to maintain a spot on this list is because up until the point that fighter gets back in the winner's bracket, we don't know what level he or she is competing at. We don't know that they're competing at the same level after a loss that got them ranked on this list in the first place. They may be irreparably damaged. Damaged psychologically, damaged physically. We just don't know. So until they prove otherwise, they lose their spot. Mikey Garcia was ranked at number 2. So he was ranked ahead of a great deal of the fighters on this list, and as a result of that, a great deal of those fighters end up moving up 1 spot. That moves Vasyl Lomachenko into the number 2 spot, for example, and all those ranked behind Vasyl Lomachenko end up moving 1 spot as a result, leaving a vacancy, a vacant spot for someone else to occupy. Now, it just so happens that the rules that govern this list dictate that in defeating a pound-for-pound fighter, you become one yourself. Anyone who's followed this channel long enough is already familiar with that rule. It's a rule that gets mixed reviews.
Everybody don't like it.
But it stands to reason that if the fighter that was defeated was ranked amongst the best fighters in the world, well then,
what's that make sense?
The guy that beat him should get some kind of credit. To some degree, the same list that recognized all the accomplishments of Mikey Garcia, for example, must then recognize the guy that conquers him. You know, it's got to be measured, it's got to be assessed in some kind of capacity, that whether or not The guy that beats a Mikey Garcia, for example, may not be as accomplished as a Mikey Garcia. There still has to be some recognition involved because Mikey Garcia was ranked amongst the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world. He was the number 2 pound-for-pound fighter on this list. Thus, whoever beats him has to get some kind of recognition for that. So as a result of Saturday night's fight, and the defeat of the 4-division champion Mikey Garcia in the welterweight division, a division he's never actually fought in, as a result of that, Errol Spence emerges in the number 10 spot of the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list. With Mikey being bumped off, all those who were ranked behind Mikey end up moving up 1 spot as a result. And that opens up the door for Errol Spence to slide into that number 10 spot. Now, for those out there that might be wondering, well, why does Errol rank so low on the list if he beat a guy who ranked so high on the list? Well, Mikey Garcia didn't emerge at number 2. It was an accumulation of efforts, an accumulation of accomplishments that got him up there. It was a gradual climb from the time that he emerged on the list. For those of you that remember, he didn't emerge anywhere near number 2. It took time for him to get up there. And just as well, anybody else who hopes to get up there, it's going to take time for them too. You know, they have to add the credibility to their argument. And the way that reflects for Errol Spence, you know, the way it affects him is, okay, you beat a pound-for-pound fighter, so you get the spot. But the pound-for-pound fighter that you beat, you know, this guy wasn't from your weight class. He wasn't a champion in your weight class. He wasn't a top contender in your weight class. So we have to compare what got you here with what got other people that are already on this list here. So when we compare it, well, you beating Mikey Garcia, who never fought in your weight class, is not a bigger feather in your cap than Vosdick, for example, beating Stevenson, a champion who was a champion in his weight class and wasn't just any champion. He was the WBC and lineal champion, you understand. We go down the list, you know, to reflect, you know, to cross-compare. How does Mikey losing to Errol, how does Errol beating Mikey compare with, let's say, Jarrett Hurd? You know, and what got him on this list. Jarrett Hurd beat the number 1 guy in his weight class. Not the number 1 guy from a lower weight class, the number 1 guy in his weight class. And he unified 2 world titles in the process. We move along the list. Sorun Visai beat what was the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in his weight class and did it 2 times. Took his belt in the process and defended that belt. Well, that's a bigger feather in his cap than, you know, Errol beating a little guy, even if the little guy was a pound-for-pound fighter. And once you apply this formula across the board, you can see why Errol ended up where he ended up at. His saving grace, it being that he's in the most danger of being bumped off, but his saving grace is to either unify a title that would allow him to move up further on the list and get himself out of danger, or if, you know, by some chance, one of these champions vacates their titles and ends up being bumped off as a result. Because yet another one of the rules that govern this list is you must be holding a minimum of 1 world title just to be ranked, just to be considered. If you ain't holding no kind of belts, then you ain't gonna have a spot on this list, because this list is only for winners and only for champions. The list itself intends to reflect, to represent, the best and brightest in the sport of boxing. It's not just champions per se, not just any champion, but it stands to reason that if you are one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world, then you will have the hardware to show for it. You will have the hardware of some kind, because this isn't just, you know, Joe Schmo who the fans are high on. The argument, the credibility, the statistics, the facts and the stats are there to corroborate that these are the best pound-for-pound fighters, among the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world. Now, I know that many of you who are watching this video know my opinion of Errol Spence's victory over Mikey Garcia, but do realize that this list operates independently of my opinion. Independent of my opinion. The rules that govern this list are the rules, and they apply to everyone, evenly, across the board. It's why those rules were put in place in the first place, because I might not be crazy about how a guy wins a fight. I myself might have my own reservations, my own opinions about what's going into a fight, how it should be viewed. I might feel a certain way, you know, I might feel that, you know, it's not as big a victory as people are making it out to be. I can feel that way, but that's why the rules are in place, so that regardless of how I feel, the list will still maintain its own standards as to not contradict itself. Do realize that there are any variety of pound-for-pound lists out there, and it's very hard to discern any logic, any actual criteria. You know, what exactly are these fighters being measured for? Because it seems like some fighters just get on there because people like them. Whereas, you know, pound for pound, in terms of a discussion in the sport of boxing, it's something that not a lot of people can agree to. Everybody has their own measure, their own barometer, their own criteria as to how they measure the best pound-for-pound fighters in the world and what logic is going into that. It varies from person to person and periodical to periodical. Thus, the most you can ask of any list that insists on ranking fighters on the premise of being pound-for-pound fighters, the most that you can ask, since there's so many varying ways to measure fighters, is that at minimum, the list not contradict itself, that the list abide by its own logic, and that's what these rules attempt to do for this list. Everybody ain't gonna have the same people on their list. Everybody's not ranking them for the same reasons. Hell, some people aren't ranking them for any reason other than they like them. You know, that's how some people's lists work. So, with so many lists and so many varying ways of measuring fighters, the most that you can ask is that the list makes sense and that it not contradict itself. And that's why these rules are in play. That's what these rules are for. So, while I might feel that a lot of people are celebrating the mediocrity of Errol Spence and how they're just desperate to inflate him as a fighter, while I might feel that way, that's my opinion, while I might feel that there are better ways to get on a pound-for-pound list than this, better ways like, you know, unifying a title or moving up in weight and becoming a champion in another weight class, while I might feel that there are better ways to get a spot on a pound-for-pound list, at the end of the day, regardless of what I feel, the rules are the rules. Errol Spence beat what was a pound-for-pound fighter on this list, and the rules dictate that in beating a pound-for-pound fighter, he became one himself. Now, him maintaining a spot on this list, it being that he's in the number 10 spot, him maintaining a spot on this list, that's quite another matter. It's going to take more than just beating, you know, popular little guys that move into your weight class. It's going to take more than that to maintain a spot on this list, because he's got some stiff competition, and they're well ahead of him. You know, getting a spot and maintaining it, that's quite another matter. So we'll see if time proves that Errol Spence belongs, that he deserves to be on this list. But as it stands today, he is ranked in the number 10 spot of the Ring IQ pound-for-pound list.